Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the past in soothing detail. Tonight, we embark on a comprehensive journey through one of history's most transformative periods, the Napoleonic Wars. In this episode, we'll explore every facet of this remarkable era, from the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte to his final defeat at Waterloo. So settle in and let the steady rhythm of history guide you toward peaceful rest. There's no need to remember every detail. Simply let the words wash over you as we travel back to the turn of the 19th century. If you enjoy this video, please do not forget to like and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you may think. Part 1. The Rise of Napoleon and the French Revolutionary Wars. To understand the Napoleonic Wars, we must first understand their predecessor, the French Revolutionary Wars. In 1789, France erupted into revolution, overthrowing centuries of monarchical rule. The execution of King Louis XVI in 1793 sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Monarchies across the continent viewed revolutionary France as an existential threat to the established order. By 1796, France found itself surrounded by hostile powers. The first coalition, comprising Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, and several smaller states, sought to crush the revolution and restore the French monarchy. It was in this crucible of conflict that a young Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte would emerge. Napoleon was born on August 15th, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica, just 1 year after the island was transferred from Genoan to French control. His family belonged to the minor Italian nobility, but they were far from wealthy. Young Napoleon received a scholarship to attend military school in mainland France, where his Corsican accent and modest background made him an outsider among the aristocratic French cadets. Despite these challenges, Napoleon excelled in mathematics and military strategy. He graduated from the École Militaire in Paris in 1785, receiving a commission as a second lieutenant in the artillery. For the next several years, he served in various garrison posts, reading voraciously about military history and theory. The works of ancient commanders like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great particularly fascinated him. When the revolution erupted in 1789, Napoleon's career accelerated. He aligned himself with the Jacobins, the most radical revolutionary faction, and caught the attention of Augustin Robespierre, brother of the infamous Maximilien Robespierre. In 1793, Napoleon played a crucial role in the siege of Toulon, where royalist forces had invited British and Spanish troops to occupy the strategic Mediterranean port. Napoleon, then a captain, devised the artillery strategy that forced the coalition forces to evacuate Toulon. His plan involved capturing key high ground positions and placing artillery batteries that could bombard both the city and the enemy fleet in the harbour. The operation succeeded brilliantly, and the 24-year-old officer was promoted to brigadier general as a reward. However, Napoleon's fortunes nearly collapsed during the Thermidorian reaction of 1794, when Maximilien Robespierre was overthrown and executed. Napoleon's association with the Robespierres led to his brief imprisonment. Only the intervention of friends and the chaos of the period saved him from the guillotine. By 1795, Napoleon had been reinstated but remained without a significant command. His opportunity came in October of that year when royalist forces attempted to overthrow the Directory, the five-man committee that governed France. Napoleon, acting on orders from Paul Barras, used artillery loaded with grape shot to disperse the royalist mob threatening the Tuileries Palace. This whiff of grape shot saved the Directory and elevated Napoleon to new prominence. In March 1796, the Directory appointed Napoleon commander of the Army of Italy. This struggling force of 30,000 men was poorly equipped, underfed, and demoralized. The Austrians and their Sardinian allies dominated northern Italy. Nobody expected the young general to achieve much in this secondary theatre of war. What followed was one of history's most brilliant military campaigns. Napoleon transformed his army through personal charisma and the promise of plunder. He defeated the Austrians and Sardinians in a series of rapid battles using speed, concentration of force, and aggressive maneuver to overcome numerically superior enemies. At the Battle of Montenotte on April 12, 1796, Napoleon defeated an Austrian force, then quickly pivoted to defeat the Sardinians at Millesimo on April 13th and 14th. He defeated another Austrian army at Dago on April 14th and 15th. This whirlwind of victories in just 4 days demonstrated Napoleon's revolutionary approach to warfare. Traditional 18th century warfare emphasized slow, methodical campaigns focused on capturing fortresses and protecting supply lines. Napoleon instead emphasized speed, living off the land and seeking decisive battle to destroy enemy armies. He concentrated his forces at critical points, achieved local superiority, and defeated his enemies in detail before they could combine against him. The Sardinians sued for peace in late April, allowing Napoleon to focus entirely on the Austrians. He crossed the Po River, repeatedly outmaneuvering the Austrian commander, General Beaulieu. At the Battle of Lodi on May 10th, 1796, Napoleon personally led his troops across a bridge under heavy fire, earning the admiration of his soldiers, who began calling him the Little Corporal, a term of endearment that stuck throughout his career. Napoleon entered Milan in triumph on May 15th. He then spent the summer consolidating his control over northern Italy, besieging the fortress of Mantua and defeating several Austrian relief attempts. The siege of Mantua lasted from June 4th, 1796 to February 2nd, 1797, making it one of the longest operations of the campaign. During this period, Napoleon defeated Austrian relief armies at Castiglione in August 1796, at Bassano in September, at Arcoli in November, and at Rivoli in January 1797. The Battle of Rivoli, fought on January 14th and 15th, was particularly significant. Napoleon defeated an Austrian force of 28,000 with only 23,000 men, capturing 6,000 prisoners and forcing the Austrians to abandon their final attempt to relieve Mantua. With Mantua's fall in February 1797, Napoleon advanced toward Vienna itself. The Austrian Archduke Charles attempted to stop him in the Alps, but Napoleon's relentless advance and Austria's exhaustion forced Emperor Francis II to negotiate. The Treaty of Campo Formio, signed on October 17, 1797, ended the War of the First Coalition. Austria ceded Belgium and Lombardy to France and recognized the French-controlled republics in northern Italy. Napoleon returned to Paris as a conquering hero. At 28 years old, he was France's most celebrated general. However, the Directory viewed him with suspicion, fearing his popularity and ambition. To keep him occupied and away from Paris, they approved his audacious plan to invade Egypt, aiming to threaten British trade routes to India. The Egyptian campaign, launched in May 1798, initially succeeded. Napoleon captured Malta on June 11th, then landed in Egypt on July 1st. He defeated the Mamluk rulers at the Battle of the Pyramids on July 21st, entering Cairo in triumph. However, Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile on August 1st, stranding Napoleon's army in Egypt. Despite this setback, Napoleon consolidated French control over Egypt, instituting administrative reforms and bringing French scholars to study Egyptian antiquities. The Rosetta Stone was discovered during this expedition on July 15, 1799, though it would eventually fall into British hands. Napoleon advanced into Syria in early 1799, besieging the fortress of Acre. The siege lasted from March 20th to May 20th, but ultimately failed, partly due to British naval support for the defenders. An outbreak of plague further devastated the French forces. Napoleon returned to Egypt, defeating an Ottoman army at Abukir on July 25, 1799. While Napoleon campaigned in Egypt, France's fortunes in Europe deteriorated. The Second Coalition, comprising Britain, Austria, Russia, Ottoman Empire, Portugal, and Naples, had formed in 1798. French armies suffered defeats in Italy and along the Rhine. The Directory's corruption and incompetence became increasingly apparent. Learning of these developments, Napoleon abandoned his army in Egypt and sailed for France with a small group of trusted officers. He landed at Fréjus on October 9th, 1799, and reached Paris on October 16th. The population greeted him enthusiastically, seeing him as the strong leader France needed. Working with Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and others, Napoleon orchestrated the coup of 18 Brumaire, which occurred on November 9th, 1799, according to the revolutionary calendar. The coup overthrew the Directory and established the consulate, a new government with 3 consuls. Napoleon manoeuvred to become first consul, effectively making himself dictator of France while maintaining republican appearances. As first consul, Napoleon quickly set about stabilizing France. He reformed the tax system, established the Bank of France in 1800, and began codifying French law, which would eventually become the Napoleonic Code. Militarily, he prepared to resume war against the Second Coalition. In May 1800, Napoleon personally led an army across the Alps, replicating Hannibal's famous feat. The crossing through the Great Street, Bernard Pass, was treacherous, with artillery pieces hauled through snow-filled passes in hollowed-out tree trunks. Napoleon reached the plains of northern Italy in mid-May, threatening the Austrian supply lines. The Battle of Marengo, fought on June 14, 1800, nearly ended in French disaster. Austrian General Melas attacked Napoleon's separated forces and initially drove them back. By afternoon, Napoleon seemed on the verge of defeat. However, General Louis Desaix arrived with reinforcements and launched a counterattack. Desaix was killed in the assault, but his attack, combined with a cavalry charge led by General Kellerman, routed the Austrians. The French captured 8,000 prisoners and 40 guns. Marengo's victory allowed Napoleon to consolidate control over northern Italy once again. In Germany, General Moreau won the decisive Battle of Hohenlinden on December 3rd, 1800, defeating the Austrians in Bavaria. These twin defeats forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Luneville on February 9th, 1801, confirming and expanding the terms of Campo Formio. Britain remained at war, but neither side could strike a decisive blow against the other. French invasion plans came to nothing due to British naval superiority. British expeditionary forces lacked the strength to challenge France on the continent. Both nations, exhausted by years of war, signed the Treaty of Amiens on March 25, 1802, bringing a temporary peace to Europe for the first time in 10 years. The peace proved to be merely a breathing space. Fundamental conflicts of interest remained unresolved. Britain refused to evacuate Malta as promised, citing French expansionism. Napoleon annexed Piedmont, transformed Switzerland into the Helvetic Republic, and extended French influence in Italy and Germany. Neither power trusted the other. During the peace, Napoleon consolidated his power in France. In August 1802, a plebiscite made him first consul for life. In May 1804, another plebiscite approved the establishment of the French Empire, and on December 2nd, 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in a lavish ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral. Pope Pius VII attended, lending religious legitimacy to Napoleon's rule, though Napoleon famously placed the crown on his own head rather than receiving it from the Pope. Part 2. The War of the Third Coalition. By 1803, war between France and Britain had resumed. Napoleon assembled the Army of England along the Channel coast, constructing flat-bottomed invasion barges and drilling his troops for an amphibious assault. At Boulogne and other Channel ports, over 150,000 men prepared for the invasion that would never come. Britain's Royal Navy, under admirals like Nelson and Collingwood, maintained a tight blockade of French ports, making any invasion attempt extremely risky. To overcome British naval superiority, Napoleon devised an elaborate plan. The French Atlantic and Mediterranean fleets would break out of their blockaded ports, combine with the Spanish fleet's Spain, having allied with France in 1804, and sail to the West Indies. The British would presumably pursue them across the Atlantic. The combined Franco-Spanish fleet would then race back to the Channel, arriving before the British could intercept them, giving Napoleon perhaps 24 to 48 hours to ferry his army across to England. The plan began to unfold in early 1805. Admiral Villeneuve escaped from Toulon with 11 ships of the line in January. After rendezvousing with Spanish ships at Cadiz, he sailed for the West Indies in March. Nelson pursued him across the Atlantic, but arrived too late to intercept him. Villeneuve, learning of Nelson's approach, sailed back toward Europe in early June. However, the plan unravelled at the Battle of Cape Finisterre on July 22nd, 1805, where a British squadron under Admiral Calder intercepted Villeneuve's fleet off the coast of Spain. Though the battle was indecisive, with Calder capturing 2 Spanish ships, it shook Villeneuve's confidence. Instead of proceeding to the Channel, he put into Cadiz, where British ships soon blockaded him. Meanwhile, Austria and Russia joined Britain in forming the Third Coalition against France. Austria resented French expansion in Italy and Germany. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, young and idealistic, viewed Napoleon as a dangerous revolutionary upstart, threatening the legitimate monarchies of Europe. The Austrian and Russian emperors signed a treaty in April 1805, committing to field armies totaling 400,000 men. Realizing the invasion of England was no longer feasible, Napoleon broke camp at Boulogne in late August 1805. With remarkable speed, he marched his army, now redesignated the Grande Armée, eastward toward Germany. Austrian armies had already invaded Bavaria, France's ally, and were advancing toward the Rhine. Napoleon's campaign plan was characteristically bold. Rather than confront the Austrians frontally, he would swing around their northern flank, cutting their communications with Vienna and forcing them to fight on his terms. The Grande Armée, organized into 7 corps of 15 to 30,000 men each, marched in parallel columns, able to concentrate rapidly when battle was joined. General Mack commanded the main Austrian army of 72,000 men centered on Ulm in southern Germany. He expected Napoleon to advance directly from the Rhine. Instead, the French corps swept around his northern flank in late September, crossing the Danube at several points and positioning themselves between Mack and Vienna. By October 14, 1805, Mack's army was completely surrounded at Ulm. After several failed breakout attempts, Mack surrendered on October 20th with 27,000 men. An additional 30,000 Austrians had been captured or dispersed in the previous weeks. It was a catastrophic defeat achieved with minimal French casualties, demonstrating Napoleon's mastery of strategic maneuver. Napoleon pressed on toward Vienna, which he entered on November 13th. The Austrian Emperor Francis had fled, and his remaining forces had retreated to link up with Russian armies advancing from the east. Napoleon now faced a strategic dilemma. His supply lines stretched back to the Rhine, his troops were exhausted from constant marching, and the combined Austro-Russian forces outnumbered him. Moreover, Prussia was mobilizing, threatening to enter the war against France. Napoleon decided to stake everything on a decisive battle. He selected a position near the Moravian town of Austerlitz and deliberately made his army appear weaker than it was, sending out peace feelers and withdrawing from key terrain. The Allied commanders, Tsar Alexander and the Austrian General Weyrother, took the bait. They developed an over-ambitious plan to outflank Napoleon's right while he was supposedly retreating. The Battle of Austerlitz, fought on December 2nd, 1805, was Napoleon's masterpiece. The date was the first anniversary of his coronation, and he commemorated it with his greatest victory. The Austro-Russian army numbered approximately 85,000 men. Napoleon had approximately 73,000. In the pre-dawn darkness, Allied columns began descending from the Pratzen Heights to execute their flanking maneuver against Napoleon's weakened right. Napoleon waited until the Allies had committed themselves, then launched his masterstroke. Marshal Soult's corps stormed up the now lightly defended Pratzen Heights, splitting the Allied army in two. Marshal Davout held the French right against vastly superior numbers, while Marshal Lannes pinned the Allied left. By early afternoon, the Allied army was in full retreat. Those forces that had descended from the Pratzen Heights found themselves trapped against frozen lakes. French artillery bombarded the ice, drowning hundreds of Allied soldiers. The Allies suffered approximately 15,000 killed and wounded and 12,000 captured. French casualties were approximately 9,000. 3 Russian generals and the Austrian chief of staff were captured. Tsar Alexander fled the battlefield in tears. Austerlitz shattered the Third Coalition. Austria signed the Treaty of Pressburg on December 26, 1805, ceding Venice, Istria, and Dalmatia to Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy and Tyrol and Vorarlberg to Bavaria. Austria also agreed to pay an indemnity of 40 million francs. Russia withdrew its forces back into Poland. However, tragedy struck at sea. On October 21st, 1805, before news of Austerlitz reached him, Admiral Villeneuve had sortied from Cadiz with 33 French and Spanish ships of the line. Nelson, with 27 ships, intercepted him off Cape Trafalgar on the southern coast of Spain. The Battle of Trafalgar resulted in a decisive British victory. Nelson divided his fleet into two columns that punched through the Franco-Spanish line, creating a close-range melee that favoured the superior British gunnery. By the battle's end, 18 Franco-Spanish ships had been captured or destroyed, with no British ships lost. However, Nelson was mortally wounded by a French sharpshooter and died on his flagship HMS Victory, uttering his famous last words, "Thank God I have done my duty." Trafalgar ensured British naval supremacy for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars and ended any realistic possibility of a French invasion of Britain. The sea would remain Britain's domain, while Napoleon dominated the continent. Part 3. The War of the Fourth Coalition. Napoleon spent the first half of 1806 reorganizing Germany according to his vision. He created the Confederation of the Rhine in July, a collection of 16 German states under French protection. This effectively dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, and Emperor Francis formally abdicated as Holy Roman Emperor on August 6, 1806, retaining only his title as Emperor of Austria. An institution that had existed for over 800 years since the time of Charlemagne thus came to an end. Prussia, which had remained neutral during the War of the Third Coalition, now felt threatened by French domination of Germany. King Frederick William III, influenced by his energetic wife Queen Louise and a war party at court, issued an ultimatum to Napoleon in September 1806, demanding French withdrawal from Germany. Napoleon, then at Bamberg organising his forces, received the ultimatum with contempt. Prussia would learn the price of challenging him. The Prussian army of 1806 enjoyed a formidable reputation based on the victories of Frederick the Great during the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. However, the army had not significantly reformed since Frederick's death in 1786. Its tactics, organisation, and leadership remained rooted in mid-18th century practice, while Napoleon's Grande Armée represented a revolutionary new system of warfare. In October 1806, Napoleon invaded Saxony with 180,000 men organised in 7 corps. The Prussians and their Saxon allies fielded approximately 130,000 men divided into 3 separate armies that failed to coordinate effectively. On October 14th, 1806, Napoleon won twin victories at Jena and Auerstedt. At Jena, Napoleon, with 96,000 men, destroyed a Prussian Saxon force of 53,000 under Prince Hohenlohe. Simultaneously, 20 miles to the north at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout, with only 27,000 men, defeated the main Prussian army of 54,000 under the Duke of Brunswick, who was mortally wounded in the battle. These twin disasters destroyed the Prussian army as a fighting force. What followed was a relentless pursuit. French cavalry and light infantry harried the retreating Prussian columns. Fortresses surrendered without serious resistance. Napoleon entered Berlin on October 27th, just 13 days after the battles. By early November, virtually all of Prussia west of the Vistula River had fallen. From Berlin, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree on November 21st, 1806, establishing the Continental system. This decree forbade all trade between continental Europe and Britain, aiming to strangle British commerce and force Britain to make peace. Neutral ships trading with Britain would be seized. The Continental system would become a defining feature of Napoleon's policy for the next 6 years, with far-reaching and ultimately counterproductive consequences. Prussia's ally Russia now entered the war. In late 1806 and early 1807, Napoleon faced Russian armies in Poland and East Prussia in the midst of brutal winter weather. The campaign proved far more difficult than his previous victories. The Russian army, though poorly led, fought with stubborn determination. The battles of Pultusk on December 26, 1806, and Golemin on the same day were bloody but indecisive. In February 1807, Napoleon fought the Battle of Eylau, one of the costliest battles of his career. On February 7th and 8th, approximately 75,000 French troops clashed with approximately 67,000 Russians in a snowstorm. The fighting was chaotic and brutal, with both sides suffering approximately 15,000 casualties. Napoleon claimed victory because the Russians retreated, but the battle demonstrated that he was not invincible. Napoleon spent the spring building up his forces and bringing siege guns to reduce the Prussian fortresses still holding out. By June, he was ready to resume the offensive. The decisive battle came at Friedland on June 14, 1807. Napoleon's 80,000 men trapped 60,000 Russians against the Al River and inflicted a crushing defeat, killing or wounding approximately 20,000 Russians for approximately 10,000 French casualties. Tsar Alexander, shaken by the defeat and disillusioned with his British allies, agreed to meet Napoleon. The two emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit on June 25, 1807. Over the next few days, they negotiated a treaty that dramatically reshaped Europe. The treaties of Tilsit, signed on July 7th and 9th, 1807, required Prussia to cede approximately half its territory, including all lands west of the Elbe River and most of its Polish territories. From the latter, Napoleon created the Duchy of Warsaw, a French satellite state. Prussia also had to accept a French occupation force and limit its army to 42,000 men. Russia, meanwhile, joined the Continental system and agreed to mediate between France and Britain. If Britain refused to make peace, Russia would join France in war against Britain. In secret articles, Napoleon and Alexander discussed dividing Europe into French and Russian spheres of influence. Alexander would have a free hand against Sweden and the Ottoman Empire, while Napoleon would dominate Western and Central Europe. For Napoleon, Tilsit marked the apex of his power. He controlled or influenced territory from the Atlantic to the Vistula, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Only Britain remained undefeated, protected by its navy and its island fortress. Part 4. The Peninsular War. Napoleon's decision to intervene in Spain and Portugal would prove one of his greatest strategic mistakes, creating what he himself called the Spanish Ulcer that drained French resources for 6 years. The crisis began with Portugal, Britain's oldest ally, which refused to enforce the Continental system. Napoleon negotiated with Spain's chief minister, Manuel de Godoy, to allow French troops to cross Spain to invade Portugal. In November 1807, General Junot led a French army across Spain and occupied Lisbon on November 30th. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil aboard ships protected by the Royal Navy. However, Napoleon's ambitions extended beyond Portugal. Spanish King Charles IV was weak and incompetent, dominated by Godoy, who was widely believed to be the Queen's lover. Crown Prince Ferdinand despised his parents and Godoy. Napoleon saw an opportunity to place his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, bringing Spain fully into the French orbit. French troops poured into Spain in early 1808, ostensibly to support the occupation of Portugal. They occupied key fortresses, including Barcelona on February 29th and Pamplona on February 16th. Marshal Murat entered Madrid on March 23rd with a large army. On March 17th, 1808, popular riots in Aranjuez forced Charles to abdicate in favour of Ferdinand. However, Napoleon summoned both Charles and Ferdinand to Bayonne in southern France. Through a combination of pressure and deception, he forced both to abdicate in his favour on May 5th and 6th, 1808. Napoleon then declared his brother Joseph King of Spain. The Spanish people reacted with outrage. On May 2nd, 1808, Madrid rose in revolt against the French occupation. Murat's troops brutally suppressed the uprising, shooting hundreds of civilians. The executions on May 3rd inspired Francisco Goya's famous paintings depicting French atrocities. The Madrid uprising triggered a nationwide rebellion. Provincial juntas declared loyalty to the deposed Ferdinand and raised armies to fight the French. On July 19th, 1808, a Spanish army of 35,000 men surrounded and forced the surrender of 20,000 French troops at Belen in Andalusia. It was Napoleon's first major military defeat, shocking Europe and emboldening resistance. Joseph abandoned Madrid, and French forces concentrated in northern Spain. Napoleon, infuriated by the defeat, decided to personally intervene. In November 1808, he crossed the Pyrenees with over 200,000 veteran troops from the Grande Armée. Napoleon's campaign in Spain was characteristically swift and devastating. He defeated Spanish armies at Burgos, Tudela, and Somosierra, recapturing Madrid on December 4th, 1808. A British expeditionary force under Sir John Moore advanced into northern Spain, but was forced to retreat to Corunna, where Moore was killed in a battle on January 16th, 1809, though the British successfully evacuated by sea. However, Austria's renewed preparations for war forced Napoleon to return to Central Europe, leaving the Spanish campaign in the hands of his marshals. This proved a critical error. While Napoleon's marshals were excellent battlefield commanders, they lacked his strategic vision and often quarrelled among themselves. Moreover, Spain's terrain and the nature of guerrilla warfare negated many French advantages. The Spanish resistance took two forms: regular armies raised by the juntas and guerrilla bands operating throughout the countryside. The term guerrilla, meaning little war, originated from this conflict. Guerrilla fighters ambushed French columns, cut communications, and assassinated isolated troops and collaborators. French reprisals, often brutal, only intensified Spanish hatred and resistance. The British returned to Portugal in 1809 under Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Landing at Lisbon in April, Wellesley began building the Anglo-Portuguese army that would eventually drive the French from the peninsula. Wellesley proved to be Napoleon's most effective opponent, combining strategic patience with tactical skill. The Peninsular War would drag on until 1814, tying down between 200,000 and 300,000 French troops who were desperately needed elsewhere. French casualties from combat, disease, and guerrilla attacks averaged 50,000 per year. Spain became a running sore that bled French military strength and moral authority. Part 5. The War of the Fifth Coalition. While Napoleon campaigned in Spain, Austria prepared for another war. Archduke Charles, Austria's most capable general, had reformed the Austrian army, introducing corps organization, improving training, and raising a militia force called the Landwehr. Austria's government believed that Spanish resistance and French commitments in the peninsula created an opportunity for revenge. Austria declared war on April 10, 1809, and immediately invaded Bavaria. Archduke Charles commanded the main Austrian army of 200,000 men. Napoleon, caught in Spain, raced back to Germany, arriving on April 17th. Over the next 5 days, in a series of battles around Regensburg-Ebensburg on April 20th, Landshut on April 21st, Eckmühl on April 22nd, and Regensburg on April 23rd, Napoleon defeated Charles and drove the Austrians back into Bohemia. Napoleon advanced on Vienna, which he occupied on May 13th, 1809, for the second time. However, Charles's army remained intact and dangerous. Napoleon decided to cross the Danube and force a decisive battle. His first attempt at Aspern-Essling on May 21st and 22nd ended in a rare defeat. Napoleon managed to get about 30,000 men across the Danube onto the north bank, but the Austrians, with 99,000 men, counterattacked fiercely. A flash flood destroyed the bridges Napoleon had built, stranding his forces. After 2 days of desperate fighting, Napoleon withdrew back to the south bank, having suffered approximately 23,000 casualties to Austria's approximately 23,000. Marshal Lannes was mortally wounded, dying on May 31st, a severe blow to Napoleon personally. Napoleon spent the next 6 weeks preparing for a second crossing. He brought up massive reinforcements, assembled pontoon bridges, and selected a different crossing point. On the night of July 4th, 1809, Napoleon began crossing the Danube with over 180,000 men. The Battle of Wagram, fought on July 5th and 6th, 1809, was one of the largest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's 188,000 men faced Charles' 154,000 Austrians. The first day saw fierce fighting with no decisive result. On the second day, Napoleon massed artillery over 100 guns against the Austrian centre and punched through with a massive column. The Austrians retreated in relatively good order, but they had suffered approximately 40,000 casualties to France's approximately 37,000. Austria could not continue the war. Charles's army was still formidable, but no relief was coming. Russia, France's ally after Tilsit, made only token efforts against Austria. Prussia remained cowed. Britain could offer only money, not armies. Emperor Francis sued for peace. The Treaty of Schönbrunn, signed on October 14, 1809, imposed harsh terms on Austria. Austria ceded territory to Bavaria, Russia, and the Duchy of Warsaw, losing approximately 20% of its population. It joined the Continental system, agreed to pay an indemnity of 85 million francs, and limited its army to 150,000 men. After Wagram, Napoleon sought to legitimize his dynasty through marriage. He divorced Josephine, who had not given him children, and negotiated to marry Archduchess Marie-Louise, daughter of Emperor Francis of Austria and grandniece of the executed Queen Marie Antoinette. The marriage took place on April 2nd, 1810, and created a family connection between Napoleon and one of Europe's oldest dynasties. On March 20th, 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, whom Napoleon titled the King of Rome. Napoleon now had an heir, seemingly securing his dynasty's future. The Grande Armée paraded through Paris in celebration, yet within 4 years Napoleon would be in exile, and his son would die young in Vienna, never ruling anything. Part 6. The Continental System and the Invasion of Russia. Between 1810 and 1812, Napoleon stood at the height of his territorial control. The French Empire proper included Belgium, the Netherlands, northwest Germany, and parts of Italy. Allied and satellite states included the Confederation of the Rhine, the Kingdom of Italy, the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Warsaw, Switzerland, and Spain. Sweden and Denmark were allies. Austria and Prussia were cowed and compliant. Only Britain, Russia, and the guerrillas in Spain remained actively hostile. The Continental system, however, was failing. Britain's economy, though strained, did not collapse. British merchants found ways around the blockade, smuggling goods into Europe. British exports to South America and the Ottoman Empire compensated for lost European markets. More damagingly, the Continental system harmed France and its allies as much as Britain. European industries and consumers needed British manufactured goods and colonial products. Enforcement required constant vigilance and generated resentment. Russia found the Continental system particularly burdensome. Russian exports timber, hemp, grain traditionally went to Britain. Tsar Alexander faced pressure from nobles whose estates depended on this trade. Moreover, the personal chemistry between Napoleon and Alexander that had flourished at Tilsit had cooled. Alexander resented Napoleon's creation of the Duchy of Warsaw, seeing it as a potential base for reconstituting Poland, Russia's ancient enemy. Napoleon resented Russia's lukewarm support during the War of the Fifth Coalition and suspected Alexander of planning to abandon the alliance. In December 1810, Russia formally withdrew from the Continental system, opening its ports to neutral shipping, which meant British goods under neutral flags. Napoleon viewed this as a betrayal and began planning war with Russia. The invasion of Russia, launched in June 1812, was the largest military operation attempted in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée of approximately 685,000 men from across his empire. Approximately 300,000 were French. The remainder came from allied and satellite states, including Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, and others. This massive force was supported by approximately 200,000 horses and organized into multiple army groups. Napoleon's plan was to advance rapidly into Russia, force the Russian army to give battle, win a decisive victory as at Austerlitz or Friedland, and dictate peace terms. He expected the campaign to last approximately 6 weeks to 2 months at most. The invasion began on June 24, 1812, when French forces crossed the Niemen River into Russia. The Russians, with approximately 230,000 men divided between two armies under Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, retreated before the French advance, avoiding battle and implementing a scorched earth policy. Napoleon advanced rapidly, capturing Vilnius on June 28th and Vitebsk on July 28th. However, the expected decisive battle never materialized. The Russians continued retreating, drawing Napoleon deeper into Russia's vast interior. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Horses died from exhaustion and lack of fodder. Soldiers fell out from disease, desertion, and the need to garrison captured cities. By mid-August, Napoleon had reached Smolensk, approximately 450 miles from the Niemen. His army had already shrunk to approximately 160,000 effectives. Losses from combat, but primarily from disease, exhaustion, and the need to protect supply lines. On August 16th and 17th, Napoleon fought the Battle of Smolensk, taking the city but failing to destroy the Russian armies, which retreated in good order. Napoleon faced a critical decision: continue toward Moscow or consolidate his position for the winter. Against the advice of some subordinates, he decided to press on, believing one more victory would force Tsar Alexander to negotiate. On September 7th, 1812, at the village of Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow, Napoleon finally got his decisive battle. The Russian commander Kutuzov, who had replaced Barclay, positioned approximately 130,000 men in strong defensive positions. Napoleon attacked with approximately 135,000 men in one of the bloodiest single-day battles in military history. The Battle of Borodino was a brutal, grinding combat that lasted from dawn to dusk. Napoleon bombarded the Russian positions with over 500 guns, then launched repeated infantry assaults. The Russians, fighting for their homeland, defended with desperate courage. French troops captured key positions like the Raevski Redoubt only after tremendous casualties. By evening, the Russians had been pushed back, but not routed. Russian casualties numbered approximately 45,000. French casualties approximately 35,000. Kutuzov retreated during the night, leaving the road to Moscow open. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14th, 1812, expecting to find a functioning city where he could rest his army and negotiate with the Tsar. Instead, he found a largely abandoned city. That night, fires broke out across Moscow, whether set deliberately by Russians or accidentally by French looters remains debated. The fires raged for 5 days, destroying approximately 3/4 of the city. Napoleon remained in Moscow for 33 days, from September 14th to October 19th, waiting for Alexander to negotiate. The Tsar refused all overtures. Napoleon's situation became increasingly precarious. He was deep in enemy territory with diminishing supplies. Winter was approaching. Russian forces harassed his flanks and threatened his communications. His army in Moscow numbered perhaps 100,000 men, a fraction of the force that had crossed the Niemen. On October 19th, Napoleon finally ordered the retreat from Moscow. He initially attempted to withdraw via a southern route through provinces not yet devastated by the war, but Kutuzov blocked him at the Battle of Maloyaroslavets on October 24th. Napoleon was forced to retreat along the same route by which he had advanced, through territory already stripped of supplies. The retreat from Moscow became one of history's great military disasters. As the Grande Armée retreated, winter came early and with exceptional severity. By early November, temperatures plummeted below freezing. Soldiers died from cold, starvation, and exhaustion. Russian forces and Cossacks harassed the retreating columns constantly, picking off stragglers. The crossing of the Berezina River from November 26th to 29th, 1812, became an epic of suffering. Russian forces nearly trapped the retreating French at the river. Engineer General Eble constructed 2 bridges under fire, allowing much of the army to escape, but thousands of stragglers were left behind and perished. Eble himself died in December from the effects of standing in the icy water while directing bridge construction. On December 5th, 1812, Napoleon left the army and raced back to Paris by sleigh and carriage, arriving on December 18th. He needed to secure his position in France and raise a new army before his enemies could exploit the disaster. He left Marshal Murat in command of the remnants. Of the approximately 685,000 men who had entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. Some were prisoners, but most had died from cold, disease, starvation, or combat. Of the approximately 200,000 horses, almost none survived. It was one of the most complete military disasters in history, destroying Napoleon's aura of invincibility. Part 7. The War of the Sixth Coalition, the German Campaign. News of the disaster in Russia electrified Europe. On December 30th, 1812, General York, commanding the Prussian contingent in the Grande Armée, signed the Convention of Tauroggen with Russia without authorization from his king, taking his troops out of the war. Prussia hesitated, but King Frederick William, pressured by public opinion and advisers like Baron von Stein and Gerhard von Scharnhorst, allied with Russia on February 28, 1813, declaring war on France. Napoleon demonstrated remarkable resilience, raising a new army of approximately 200,000 men by April 1813. However, this force lacked the quality of the original Grande Armée. Many troops were young conscripts, poorly trained. Cavalry was particularly weak, as horses took years to train and replace. Nevertheless, Napoleon took the field confident he could defeat the Russians and Prussians separately before other powers joined them. The spring campaign of 1813 saw Napoleon win victories at Lutzen on May 2nd and Bautzen on May 20th and 21st. However, these were tactical victories, not the decisive battles of annihilation Napoleon needed. The Russo-Prussian armies retreated but remained intact as fighting forces. French cavalry weakness prevented effective pursuit. Both sides agreed to an armistice from June 4th to August 10th, 1813. Napoleon used this time to rebuild his forces, but so did his enemies. Austria, which had remained neutral, mediated negotiations that went nowhere. Napoleon refused to make the territorial concessions Austria demanded. On August 12, 1813, Austria declared war on France, joining the Sixth Coalition. Sweden also joined, led by Crown Prince Bernadotte, formerly one of Napoleon's marshals. The coalition now commanded approximately 500,000 troops in Central Europe, organized in three main armies: the Army of Silesia under Blücher, the Army of Bohemia under Schwarzenberg, and the Army of North Germany under Bernadotte. The coalition adopted the Trachenberg Plan, avoiding battle with Napoleon himself while attacking his marshals. When Napoleon marched against one Allied army, it would retreat. Meanwhile, the other Allied armies would attack isolated French corps. This strategy frustrated Napoleon, preventing him from concentrating for a decisive battle. In August and September 1813, Napoleon won victories at Dresden on August 26th and 27th, but could not prevent his subordinates from being defeated at Grossbeeren on August 23rd, the Katzbach on August 26th, Kulm on August 29th and 30th, and Dennowitz on September 6th. Each Allied victory weakened French forces and emboldened the coalition. Napoleon fell back toward Leipzig, where he concentrated approximately 195,000 men. The three Allied armies converged on Leipzig with approximately 365,000 troops. The Battle of Leipzig, fought from October 16th to 19th, 1813, became known as the Battle of Nations due to the number of countries involved. The first day, October 16th, saw fierce but inconclusive fighting south of Leipzig. Napoleon held his positions against Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia. October 17th was relatively quiet as both sides rested and manoeuvred. On October 18th, Blücher's army of Silesia and Bernadotte's army of North Germany joined the battle, surrounding Napoleon on three sides. During the fighting on October 18th, Saxon and other German contingents fighting for Napoleon defected to the Allies, opening a gap in the French lines. Napoleon ordered a retreat that night. On October 19th, as the French withdrew through Leipzig, a bridge was prematurely destroyed, trapping thousands of French soldiers, including several generals. Marshal Poniatowski drowned trying to swim the Ulster River. The Battle of Leipzig cost Napoleon approximately 73,000 casualties, including prisoners and defectors, while the Allies suffered approximately 54,000. More importantly, it destroyed Napoleon's position in Germany. His German allies abandoned him. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved. Napoleon retreated across the Rhine into France by early November, having lost all his conquests east of the Rhine. Part 8. The Campaign of France and Napoleon's First Abdication. For the first time since 1792, France faced invasion. The coalition, however, was not united in its war aims. Britain, Russia, and Austria each had different objectives. Some coalition leaders wanted to restore the Bourbon monarchy. Others merely wanted to contain France within its pre-revolutionary borders. Napoleon rejected peace proposals that would have left him on the throne of a France reduced to its 1792 borders. Instead, he chose to fight. In January 1814, he assembled approximately 70,000 troops and prepared to defend France. The main coalition army, approximately 200,000 strong under Schwarzenberg, advanced from the east toward Paris. Blücher led approximately 50,000 Prussians and Russians advancing from the northeast. Napoleon, outnumbered approximately 4-1 overall, decided to defeat the invaders in detail using interior lines and his superior operational skill. The campaign of France showcased Napoleon's tactical brilliance. At Brienne on January 29th, La Rotière on February 1st, Champaubert on February 10th, Montmirail on February 11th, Château-Thierry on February 12th, Vauchamp on February 14th, Montereau on February 18th, and Craonne on March 7th, Napoleon won a series of victories against separated Allied forces. However, these tactical victories could not overcome strategic realities. The coalition replaced losses quickly. Napoleon could not. Each French casualty was irreplaceable. Moreover, Allied armies learned to cooperate better, maintaining communications and supporting each other. By late March 1814, the Allies decided to ignore Napoleon's army and march directly on Paris. On March 30th, after the Battle of Paris, Marshal Marmont surrendered the city to the Allies. The Empress Marie-Louise and the King of Rome had already fled to Blois. Napoleon, at Fontainebleau with approximately 60,000 troops, initially wanted to march on Paris and continue fighting. However, his marshals, led by Ney, refused. On April 4th, they confronted Napoleon and demanded abdication. Faced with a mutiny by his oldest comrades, Napoleon agreed. On April 6th, 1814, Napoleon abdicated unconditionally. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed on April 11, granted Napoleon sovereignty over the island of Elba, a small island off the coast of Tuscany with approximately 12,000 inhabitants. He was allowed to keep the title Emperor and received a pension. Marie-Louise and his son were given the duchies of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastalla. Napoleon left Fontainebleau on April 20, bidding farewell to his imperial guard in an emotional scene. He sailed from Fréjus on April 28 and arrived at Elba on May 4, 1814. After dominating Europe for over a decade, he now ruled an island measuring approximately 86 square miles. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, returned to France and was restored to the throne. The Bourbon Restoration was supposedly constitutional, with Louis granting a charter that established a parliament and guaranteed certain rights. However, many French people viewed the Restoration with suspicion, seeing Louis as imposed by foreign armies. Part 9. The Congress of Vienna and the 100 Days. While Napoleon reorganized Elba's iron mines and created a tiny army and navy, the victorious powers met in Vienna to reorganize Europe. The Congress of Vienna, which ran from September 1814 to June 1815, brought together the major powers: Britain, represented by Castlereagh and later Wellington, Russia by Tsar Alexander, Austria by Metternich, and Prussia by Hardenberg and Wilhelm von Humboldt. France, represented by the wily Talleyrand, was eventually admitted to the discussions. The Congress aimed to create a stable European order based on legitimacy, the balance of power, and containment of future French aggression. Russia gained most of Poland. Prussia received the northern Rhineland and much of Saxony. Austria regained northern Italy, and the Netherlands were united with Belgium under the House of Orange. the Italian states were restored, mostly under Austrian influence. The German states were organized into a loose German confederation. While the diplomats danced and negotiated in Vienna, the Congress was famous for its balls and entertainments. Napoleon grew restless on Elba. He received disturbing reports from France. Louis XVIII's government was unpopular, the army was discontented, and many of his veterans faced persecution or unemployment. Moreover, Napoleon heard rumours that the coalition powers might move him to a more remote location, perhaps Saint Helena in the South Atlantic. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with approximately 1,000 soldiers of his guard. He landed at Gulf Juan on the French coast on March 1st. The gamble was enormous. He had fewer than 1,000 men and faced a French army of hundreds of thousands nominally loyal to Louis XVIII. However, Napoleon bet correctly on the army's loyalty. Troops sent to arrest him instead rallied to him. At Laffrey on March 7th, Napoleon confronted a battalion sent to stop him, opening his coat and declaring, "Soldiers of the 5th, if you wish to kill your emperor, here I am." The troops cheered, "Vive l'Empereur," and joined him. Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, also rallied to Napoleon when they met. Napoleon's march to Paris became a triumphal procession. He entered Paris on March 20th, 1815, while Louis XVIII fled to Ghent. The 100 Days had begun Napoleon's final grasp for power. Napoleon immediately set about organising France for the inevitable war. The coalition powers, meeting in Vienna, declared Napoleon an outlaw on March 13th and pledged to field 700,000 troops to overthrow him. Napoleon knew his only chance was to strike quickly before the coalition armies could concentrate. Napoleon assembled approximately 128,000 troops and marched into Belgium in June, aiming to defeat the Allied armies there before Russian and Austrian reinforcements arrived. Wellington commanded approximately 95,000 British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops in Belgium. Blücher led approximately 124,000 Prussians nearby. Napoleon hoped to drive between them, defeat each separately, then march on Brussels. On June 16, 1815, Napoleon achieved his strategic goal, positioning his army between the Allied forces. He sent Marshal Ney with the left wing to hold Wellington at Quatre Bras, while he attacked Blücher at Ligny with the right wing. The Battle of Ligny, fought on June 16th, was Napoleon's last victory. His 77,000 men defeated Blücher's 84,000 Prussians, inflicting approximately 25,000 casualties for approximately 12,000 French losses. However, Blücher's army retreated in good order northward toward Wavre, not eastward as Napoleon expected. Meanwhile, at Quatre Bras, Ney fought an indecisive battle against Wellington. Ney's 48,000 men attacked Wellington's 36,000 troops but failed to break through, partly because Marshal d'Erlon's corps marched back and forth between the two battlefields on confused orders, participating effectively in neither. On June 17th, Wellington, learning of Blücher's defeat, retreated northward to a position he had previously scouted near the village of Waterloo. Napoleon pursued with approximately 77,000 men, while Marshal Grouchy took 33,000 troops to pursue Blücher. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, decided Napoleon's fate and ended the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon delayed his attack until approximately 11:30 in the morning, hoping the ground would dry after heavy rain the previous night, making it easier to move artillery. This delay proved crucial, giving Blucher time to march to Wellington's aid. Wellington positioned approximately 67,000 troops, British, Dutch, Belgian, and German, on a ridge south of Waterloo. Napoleon attacked with approximately 77,000 men, launching a series of powerful but ultimately unsuccessful assaults against Wellington's lines. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Napoleon ordered an infantry attack against Wellington's left centre. This attack, led by d'Erlon's corps, was repulsed by British infantry in line formation and destroyed by British heavy cavalry charges. The French cavalry, however, cut down the pursuing British cavalry. Around 4 o'clock, Ney, believing Wellington was retreating based on the movement of wounded to the rear, launched massive cavalry charges against Wellington's centre. For approximately 2 hours, French cavalry repeatedly charged British infantry squares. The squares held firm, and French cavalry suffered terrible losses from British artillery and musket fire. Around 4:30, Prussian advance elements began arriving on Napoleon's right flank. Napoleon was now fighting on 2 fronts. He sent his young guard to hold the Prussians at Plancenoit, while continuing to attack Wellington. Around 6:30, Ney captured the farm complex of La Haye-Sainte in Wellington's centre, creating a dangerous salient in the Allied lines. Napoleon, however, had no reserves immediately available to exploit this breakthrough, having committed his guard battalions to defending against the Prussians. Around 7 o'clock, Napoleon launched his final attack, sending forward battalions of the Imperial Guard, his elite troops who had never been defeated. The Guard advanced in column against Wellington's centre-right. British Guards Brigade, lying concealed, rose and delivered devastating volleys at close range. The Imperial Guard, shaken, retreated for the first time in their history. The cry went up, "La Garde recule!" The Guard retreats! The French army, which had fought all day with desperate courage, finally broke. Wellington ordered a general advance. The Prussians attacked from the east. The French retreat became a rout. Napoleon left the battlefield around 8 o'clock and fled toward Paris. French casualties at Waterloo numbered approximately 31,000 killed, wounded or captured. Wellington's forces suffered approximately 17,000 casualties. The Prussians lost approximately 7,000. More importantly, Napoleon's last army was destroyed. The 100 days were over. Part 10. Aftermath and Legacy. Napoleon reached Paris on June 21st, 1815. He considered fighting on, but political support had evaporated. On June 22nd, he abdicated for the second time, this time in favour of his son, though the Allies ignored this claim. Napoleon initially planned to escape to America, but delayed too long. By the time he reached the Atlantic coast, British ships blockaded the ports. On July 15th, 1815, Napoleon surrendered to Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon, appealing to British honour and hoping for asylum in England. The British government, however, had no intention of allowing Napoleon to remain anywhere he might again threaten European peace. They decided to exile him to Saint Helena, a remote volcanic island in the South Atlantic, approximately 1,200 miles from the nearest land. Napoleon arrived at Saint Helena on October 15, 1815. He would spend the remaining 5 years and 7 months of his life there, confined to a small estate at Longwood House. The British assigned Hudson Lowe as governor, and relations between Napoleon and Lowe were consistently hostile. Napoleon spent his exile dictating his memoirs, arguing his case to history, and complaining about his treatment. He received occasional visitors who published accounts of their conversations. His health gradually deteriorated. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon died, probably from stomach cancer, though some have speculated about arsenic poisoning from wallpaper or deliberate murder, though most historians find these theories unconvincing. Napoleon was buried on Saint Helena. In 1840, his remains were returned to France and entombed at Les Invalides in Paris, where they rest today beneath a magnificent dome in a tomb of red quartzite. The Napoleonic Wars had transformed Europe. The Congress of Vienna created a new European order that, despite subsequent revolutions and crises, maintained general peace among the great powers until 1914. The Concert of Europe, a system of regular congresses and consultations among the powers, helped manage disputes without general war. Napoleon's legal reforms, particularly the Napoleonic Code, influenced legal systems worldwide. The code established principles of equality before the law, protection of property rights, and secular authority. Many European and Latin American countries adopted versions of the code, and it remains influential today. Napoleon's military legacy was profound. His campaigns revolutionized warfare, introducing corps organization, living off the land, rapid maneuver, and concentration of force at decisive points. Military thinkers studied his campaigns for generations. The German general staff system, Prussian military reforms, and later military developments all reflected lessons learned fighting Napoleon. Politically, Napoleon's career demonstrated both the potential and the limits of military genius. He proved that extraordinary ability and determination could overthrow established orders and create an empire. He also proved that even the most brilliant general cannot indefinitely defy the combined resources of determined coalitions. The Napoleonic Wars cost an estimated 3.5 to 6 million lives, both military and civilian. France lost approximately 1 million soldiers. Russia lost approximately 450,000 to 1 million. Austria lost approximately 400,000. Prussia lost approximately 134,000. Britain lost approximately 311,000. Spain lost approximately 300,000 to 600,000. The human cost was staggering. The wars also accelerated nationalism, particularly in Germany and Italy. The experience of foreign occupation and the examples of the French nation in arms inspired nationalist movements that would eventually lead to German and Italian unification in the 1860s and 1870s. For France, the legacy was complex. Napoleon brought glory and disaster in equal measure. He made France the dominant continental power, but left it defeated, occupied, and reduced to its pre-revolutionary borders. He created a legend of French military prowess while destroying a generation of French soldiers. French popular culture alternately celebrated and criticized him. In Britain, Napoleon became the ultimate foreign threat, the bogeyman used to justify military spending and vigilance. Wellington became a national hero, and Waterloo entered British consciousness as the epitome of victory against overwhelming odds, though the battle was actually quite close. In Germany, the Napoleonic occupation sparked both reform and resentment. Prussian reformers like Stein, Hardenberg, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau used the humiliation of Jena to push through modernizing reforms that eventually made Prussia the leading German power. The experience of French rule both introduced progressive reforms and generated nationalist resistance. In Russia, the victory over Napoleon became a source of immense national pride. The War of 1812 entered Russian historical consciousness as the Patriotic War, a moment when Russians united to defeat foreign invasion. Tolstoy's War and Peace immortalized the campaign in literature. In Spain, the Peninsular War left deep scars. The guerrilla warfare and French reprisals brutalized society. The restored Bourbon monarchy was reactionary and unstable. Spain entered a century of political instability, military pronunciamientos and civil wars, though the memory of resistance to Napoleon also created a source of national pride. The ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, spread throughout Europe despite Napoleon's eventual defeat. The Code Napoleon, administrative reforms, the end of feudalism in many regions, and the example of popular sovereignty all influenced subsequent European development. Napoleon claimed to defend revolutionary principles while creating a new autocracy, but the principles he claimed to represent outlived his empire. Napoleon's personality was contradictory. He was capable of inspiring tremendous loyalty and equally tremendous hatred. His soldiers adored him. His enemies considered him a bloodthirsty tyrant. He was capable of great administrative insight and spectacular strategic blunders. He was a military genius who understood battlefield tactics and operations brilliantly, but whose strategic judgment became increasingly flawed as his power grew. His Egyptian expedition, though it ended in military failure, contributed to Egyptology and sparked European fascination with ancient Egypt. His invasion of Russia was perhaps the greatest strategic miscalculation in military history. His decision to intervene in Spain created an ulcer that bled his empire for 6 years. Yet his campaigns in Italy, Germany, and the early years of his empire demonstrated military brilliance rarely equalled. Napoleon's legacy in art and culture was significant. Romantic artists and writers were both inspired and appalled by him. Beethoven initially dedicated his Third Symphony to Napoleon, but scratched out the dedication when Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Byron celebrated Napoleon's downfall, yet also saw in him a titan brought low by smaller men. The Napoleonic era saw significant developments in military technology, though these were evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Artillery improved in standardization and mobility. Infantry tactics evolved, with skirmishers and light infantry playing larger roles. Cavalry remained important, though its dominance was ending. The rifle began to replace the musket, though this transition was not completed during the Napoleonic Wars. The logistical challenges of the Napoleonic Wars were unprecedented. Moving hundreds of thousands of men across vast distances required organizational skills and resources on a scale not seen since the Roman Empire. The development of corps organization, with each corps essentially a miniature balanced army capable of independent action, was one of Napoleon's most important innovations. Naval warfare during the Napoleonic Wars was dominated by Britain's Royal Navy. After Trafalgar, French naval power never recovered. Britain used its naval supremacy to blockade French ports, protect its trade, and project power globally. British naval victories in the Baltic, Mediterranean, and Atlantic secured British interests while denying Napoleon the ability to challenge British sea lanes. The impact on civilian populations was severe. Armies requisitioned food and supplies, often leaving civilians to starve. Cities were besieged and bombarded. Guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency operations brutalized Spain and Russia. The Continental system disrupted trade and caused economic hardship. Conscription took millions of men from productive work, devastating families and communities. The Congress of Vienna's settlement has been both praised and criticized. It restored many pre-revolutionary boundaries and monarchies, seemingly reversing revolutionary changes. However, it also created a balance of power that prevented general European war for 99 years. The conservative order it established was eventually overthrown by nationalism and democracy, but it provided stability during a transition from absolute monarchy to more representative systems. Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of history's most studied and controversial figures. He was simultaneously a product of the revolution and its betrayer, a military genius and a flawed strategist, a reformer and an autocrat, a symbol of French glory and the cause of French disaster. His rise from obscure Corsican officer to master of Europe is a story of talent, ambition, and opportunity. His fall reminds us that even the greatest power has limits, and that coalitions of determined opponents can overcome seemingly invincible forces. The Napoleonic Wars marks the end of one era and the beginning of another. The old order of absolute monarchies and aristocratic privilege was shaken, though not destroyed. The new order of nationalism, popular sovereignty, and industrial warfare was emerging. Napoleon stood at this crossroads, embodying both the old world's military genius and the new world's revolutionary energy. In the end, Napoleon's empire lasted barely more than a decade in its fullest extent, from his coronation in 1804 to his first abdication in 1814. Yet in that brief span, he changed Europe irreversibly. The maps were redrawn, kingdoms fell and rose, millions died. But the ideas of equality before law, careers open to talent, and national self-determination, however imperfectly Napoleon embodied them, were unleashed and could not be put back. The Napoleonic Wars thus stand as both an ending and a beginning, a final expression of absolute personal rule and military conquest in the style of Alexander or Caesar, and a foreshadowing of the nationalist mass warfare of the 20th century. Napoleon himself, dying on a lonely South Atlantic island, became a legend, studied by military theorists, debated by historians, and remembered by peoples he both inspired and oppressed. The legacy continues. The wars Napoleon fought ended over 200 years ago, but we still study his campaigns, still debate his achievements and crimes, still marvel at his rise and fall. In this sense, history never truly ends. It echoes through the centuries, reminding each generation of humanity's capacity for both greatness and destruction, for both creation and devastation. And with that, we conclude tonight's episode of Sleepless History. Whether you've drifted off to peaceful sleep or remained awake through this entire journey through the Napoleonic Wars, we thank you for spending this time with us. History is vast and complex, full of human drama and consequence. Sometimes, the best way to absorb it is simply to let it wash over you in the quiet hours of night, when the modern world fades and the past comes alive in words. Until next time, sleep well and remember that history, however distant, shaped the world we inhabit today. Good night.